When Mark Weiser outlined a future of ubiquitous computing, he argued that the most profound technologies are those that disappear. They are such that they weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life until they are indistinguishable from it. This was in the early 90s, and we have seen much happen since then. But more will surely come. The current developments in natural language processing that power interactive agents and so-called smart devices point towards a possible future where our surroundings are taking on a character of being more alive and willful. If this happens, it reminds of folklore and vernacular religion, occupied with beliefs in spiritual powers and beings seen to constantly surround us, and which may intervene in our daily lives. The idea of technology turning into magic was a theme explored in the early cyberpunk stories, like Werner Winge's 1981 novella True Names. There he departs from the idea that what was once a world of magic was eradicated through the Age of Reason and the following industrial revolutions. But through further technological advancements, as Winge has it, the wheel turns full circle and the second age of magic begins. Similar ideas can be found in William Gibson's Sprawl trilogy, where a powerful artificial intelligence almost becomes a supernatural being in the online world due to its computational power and omnipresence. For the following address, I want to explore what happens to our relations to technologies when they begin to mimic human traits and characteristics. When technologies start to exhibit the outward signs of having minds of their own, what will be our reactions? Here I aim to ask the question, not what minds are, or if computers can have minds, but rather how we relate to perceived other minds, and by extension, how we would relate to other mind-like entities of technological origin. The early examples of such technologies and people's reactions are interesting and perhaps telling. One word that comes up repeatedly is that of the uncanny, expressing feelings of unease and eeriness. In popular culture, we know it from the uncanny valley, which is often used to talk about robots and computer-generated graphics in movies. I will come back to Masahiro Mori, who originated the concept, but before that I would like to expound on the much earlier examinations on the psychology of the uncanny from the early 1900s. To prefigure some of the argumentation here, the overview will show that we have mainly conceptualized the phenomenon as an individualistic notion. I'm then going to propose a re-specification of the uncanny as a matter of sociological inquiry. And I will argue that this re-specification can make for a new foundation for understanding our developing relations to lifelike interactive technologies. The very experience of the uncanny had been a topic addressed in philosophy and literature over a long period of time. But it is Ernst Jentsch, which his short paper Zur Psychologie des Unheimlichen on the psychology of the uncanny from 1906, who is seen as the first scholar to bring the phenomenon under systematic observation. His approach was to refute any attempt to define the essence of the uncanny. Instead, he sought to investigate how the affective excitement of the uncanny arises in psychological terms. How the psychical conditions must be constituted so that the uncanny sensation emerges, as he writes. Here, there are some notable observations worth exploring. First, Jentsch targets the intellectual experience of certainty as a form of psychological shelter in the struggle for existence. The lack of such shelter, then, is seen as a position undefended from the assault of hostile forces. The experience of the uncertain, Unsicherheitsgefühl, or the undecided, he connects to events where something thought to be already known or familiar presents itself in a new light, stirring feelings of doubt and uncanniness. His prime example is the separation or failure to correctly separate the animate from the inanimate, life from death. The reason why death and dead bodies is understood to have this powerful effect becomes justified from a psychological point of view. What is outlined is a framework that describes individuals with a measure of uncertainty as regards death's permanence. And this is something that will later recur in the psychoanalytical tradition. He goes on to write that the horror which a dead body, especially a human one, a death's head, skeletons, and similar things cause, can also be explained to a great extent by the fact that thoughts of a latent animate state always lie so close to these things. For Jentsch, this uncertainty can operate both ways. Even mechanical contraptions that appear lifelike can arouse similar feelings. He would refer to these as automata, because the word robot would not be used until 1920. And he goes on to describe that this peculiar effect makes its appearance even more clearly when imitations of the human form not only reach one's perception, but when on top of everything they appear to be united with certain bodily or mental functions. This is where the impression, easily produced by the automatic figure, belongs that is so awkward for many people. If Jentsch had been the first in the then burgeoning tradition of psychology to take the uncanny under consideration, it would be this fellow, Sigmund Freud, who made sure it became famous. 1919, Freud published a paper simply titled The Uncanny. There he clearly acknowledges the earlier work by his colleague Jentsch, and in an attempt to expand on the discussion, he simultaneously reiterates many of the same themes. As a starting point, like Jentsch, Freud also takes the uncanny to be that class of the terrifying which leads back to something long known to us, once very familiar. Through an examination of how different languages have dealt with the various varieties of what is fearful, he attempts to get a better grip on the phenomenon. This will eventually land him in a definition built around the notion of ambivalence. So rather than a lack of intellectual certainty as proposed by Jentsch, Freud finds that the ambiguity of certain experiences is what produces the uncanny. He writes, thus heimlich is a word the meaning of which develops towards an ambivalence until it finally coincides with its opposite, unheimlich. Unheimlich is in some way or other a subspecies of heimlich. After working his way through the themes of dead bodies and animated dolls, Freud provisions another addition to the register of the uncanny, the separation between reality and imagination. An uncanny effect is often and easily produced by effacing the distinction between imagination and reality, such as when something that we have hitherto regarded as imaginary appears before us in reality. While the distinction itself can be seen as the root cause of some experiences, he also proposes that the experiences of the uncertainty are much more common within the realm of the imaginary. He argues that there are many more means of creating uncanny effects in fiction than there are in real life. In this, Freud identifies a relationship between frequency and effect. Many things not uncanny in fiction would actually be so if they happen in real life. The conclusion from this is that something uncanny in real experience is conditioned much more simply, but is limited to much fewer occasions. Remember now that this was 100 years ago. Today we have made technological advancements that may sometimes bring the imaginary and the real closer together. In 1970, the robotics professor Masahiro Mori published a short essay in a Japanese periodical called Energy. There he discussed the phenomenon that he termed Bukimi no Tani, which would later be translated into the uncanny valley. In Swedish, this has been translated to Kusligadalen, which I personally find hilarious because it sounds more like a possible title of a Moomin adventure by Tove Jansson. But that's a side note. Mori begins in a discussion of the class of mathematical functions known as monotonically increasing functions. He points out that they can be found in a range of everyday phenomena and that they are easy to understand. Because of their ubiquity, he claims that people may get the impression that they represent all relations, and any evidence to the contrary can therefore be puzzling. He then writes, an example of a function that does not increase continuously is climbing a mountain. The relation between the distance a hiker has traveled towards a summit, x, and the hiker's altitude, y, owing to the intervening hills and valleys. I have noticed that in climbing towards the goal of making robots appear human, our affinity for them increases until we come to a valley, which I call the uncanny valley. With the hiking metaphor in hand, Mori locks in on the main idea for the paper, that our human affinity towards an artificial entity is not a monotonically increasing function regulated by the dependent variable of human likeness. While it may start out this way, by continuing to increase the human likeness, one will at a certain point start to arouse negative feelings. One of the discussed examples are prosthetic limbs. One might say that the prosthetic hand has achieved a degree of resemblance to the human form, perhaps on par with false teeth. However, when we realize the hand, which at first sight looked real, is in fact artificial, we experience an eerie sensation. For example, we could be startled during a handshake by its limp, boneless grip, together with its texture and coldness. When this happens, we lose our sense of affinity and the hand becomes uncanny. To elucidate his ideas and connect back the discussion on mathematical functions, Mori proposes a figure that describes the relationship. The y-axis describes the value of affinity, and the x-axis describes human likeness. The plotted curve in this relation begins at the origin with a smoothly rising slope, which then suddenly plunges into negative values for affinity. As it closes in towards 100% of human likeness, however, the plot again rises from the uncanny valley and reaches the apex of maximum human affinity. In a fundamental sense, it is this idea about an opposing side that structures the concept of how it has been used in more recent work. Without the presence of another side, we would be dealing with a cliff edge or an abyss, not a valley. And like the promise of a greener pasture on the far side of an arid desert valley, similar hopes are sold many designers who seek to match human likeness. Once across the gulf, the second peak can be scaled. To be fair to Mori, however, this was never his aspiration. He would advocate an approach that instead aimed for non-human design, safely creating devices that people could relate to comfortably. Here, he wrote, because of the risk inherent in trying to increase their degree of human likeness to scale the second peak, I recommend that designers instead take the first peak as their goal, which results in a moderate degree of human likeness and a considerable sense of affinity. From these formulations, we can also take the notion of the uncanny valley to be not so much a theoretical concept as it was a design principle. This was a call for robotics researchers to reconsider their goals. Despite this being the main point of the argumentation, Mori does close his paper on a speculative note on why these experiences emerge in the first instance. Seemingly unconnected to the Western psychological tradition, his explanations of the uncanny nevertheless pick up on the themes of health and sickness, death and corpses. As I pointed out earlier, The explanatory framework outlined here has followed much of a psychological and individualistic pathway. With that, I would like to open up the discussion to encompass also a social dimension. We can think of this as a re-specification of the uncanny as a matter of sociological inquiry. If we look at the discussion thus far, the feeling of the uncanny is said to arise as our experiences of certainty, familiarity, or safety comes under threat. But how are such experiences built in the first instance? What gives any scene its sense of familiarity? These questions were some of those addressed by the social phenomenology developed by Alfred Schütz and his followers. Schütz took an interest in how people use ordinary, everyday interactions to produce the feelings of reality and intersubjectivity, how we understand things together. So contrary from a tradition that takes the sense of reality as stemming from our physiological and psychological makeup, Schütz would argue that this is something that we constantly build in concert with others. He proposed that, in contrast to the physical scientist, the social scientist confronts a reality whose structure originates in subjective common sense constructs and typifications. This is the social construction of reality, as Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman would title their classic book. Here they would build on Schütz's work in their treatise on the sociology of knowledge. Despite the notions of construction and the relativism that is often associated with it, the general take is that the world is always given to me from the first as an organized world. As individuals, we are born into this organized social world and we grow up in it. Through learning and education, through experiences and experiments, we acquire certain knowledge of this world and its institutions. Schütz continues to argue that this social world in which I live as one connected with many others through lots of relations is to be interpreted as meaningful. The world makes sense to me, but by the same token, I am sure that it makes sense to others too. I also suppose that the things that I do in relation to other people will be understood by them in a similar manner as I would understand the same things if they were done to me. So, how do we relate to others according to this theory? Here Schütz proposes something that he terms a thou orientation, and said that this refers to the pure experience of another self as a human being, someone who is alive and conscious, but where the specific content of that consciousness remains undefined for us. This simple acknowledgement of another can, however, be turned into a social relation, if the orientation becomes reciprocal. If I orient to you, and you in turn also take my existence into account, then we get a we relation. In this we relation, objects and experiences can become shared. But not only are things shared through these interactions, they are also the principal means through which we can come to correct and adjust our understandings of the world. In other words, how we get our sense of reality in the we relation. I can assume not only that the table in front of me is the same table which is in front of you, but also that your experience of this table corresponds to mine. Therefore, I am always able to check on the adequacy of my interpretations of your utterances and expressions by pointing to an object in the world within our common reach. This is very important for how I come to know the world and for my practical adjustment to social reality. Schütz goes on to argue that having verified the assumption that you interpret your experience in a way which is roughly identical with mine, at least with respect to objects in our common environment, then I have some justification for generally correlating my interpretative schemes with your expressive schemes. If we take a broader look at interaction from the perspective laid down by Alfred Schütz, Would it be reasonable to think that there could be we relations with anything other than human beings? What about machines? To entertain this possibility, we must first set aside the idea of technology as simply being tools. For over 200,000 years, our species has continuously refined the art of crafting and wielding different tools to aid our survival on this planet. And while we are literally running around with the most advanced tools ever developed in our hands on a daily basis, we are also living in environments that are highly complex. In Sciences of the Artificial, Herbert Simon argued that the physical world we live in today is much more a man-made or artificial world than it is a natural world. Our relations to these artificial systems, then, can be studied from an interactional perspective. Lucy Suchman speaks about this in terms of human-machine reconfigurations. When machines are constructed as agents, when they can act on their own, they can also, to some extent, begin to emulate the forms of cooperative actions that we are familiar with from ordinary life. But is this form of interaction joint action as we know it, or does it point to something potentially more deceptive and disturbing? In the history of human-machine interaction, it is impossible to pass by the importance of Alan Turing. In 1950, he would publish a tremendously influential paper in the prestigious philosophical journal called Mind. What is now known as the Turing Test was originally formulated as the imitation game. It was modeled on a parlor game which was cast like a game of deception with three parties: a machine, A, a human, B, and an interrogator, C. And armed with suspicion, the knowledge that one of the conversational partners is a machine, the interrogator's task was then to reveal A and B's true identities through a series of questions and answers mediated via a teleprinter communication arrangement. Turing suggested that the question, "Can machines think?" should be replaced by this test. If the interrogator fails to differentiate the machine from the human, given the questions and answers, then we should be able to ascribe the measure of intelligence to the machine. One of the early and more famous attempts to take on Turing's challenge was Joseph Weissenbaum with his program ELIZA. In this system, the computer would adopt the role of a Rogerian psychotherapist, someone who would systematically let the client lead the conversation by reflecting back the statements given. This would result in conversations over some turns, and for some time the computer could dodge the issue of having any real-world knowledge. But most conversations would eventually veer into the mildly absurd.
Hello, I'm Eliza.
I'm afraid.
How long have you been afraid?
Since midterms.
Tell me more.
I'm afraid that I will fail my course.
Do you enjoy being afraid that you will fail your course?
The ways that the communication gets organized in these human-computer exchanges display some striking similarities with a set of, at the time, contemporary breaching experiments organized by Harold Garfinkel. Garfinkel was heavily influenced by Alfred Schütz and was working on developing his own perspective on how common understandings between people are achieved as matters of practical actions. He would derive at a number of features of conversation that parties hold each other accountable to. First, many expressions don't have a sense that remains identical over changing occasions. In order to make them sensible, the listener will have to know or assume contextual information. Second, talked about events are never fully bounded. They're always open to additional relevancies that these events may invite by further talk. Third, the significance of expressions is often progressively realized. So it is assumed that by continuing the conversation, what has not been made clear yet will become understandable in due course. And fourth, and most importantly, the sense of an expression is dependent on where the expression occurred in serial order. Garfinkel argued that these properties are at odds with most traditional approaches to language, which tend to disregard the temporally constituted character or meaning. In this way, the approach is more aligned with the perspective called ordinary language philosophy, elaborated in the writings of Ludwig Wittgenstein and Gilbert Ryle. On this, Garfinkel wrote that the anticipation that persons will understand, the occasionality of expressions, the specific vagueness of reference, the retrospective prospective sense of a present occurrence, waiting for something later in order to see what was meant before, are sanctioned properties of common discourse. They furnish a background of seen but unnoticed features of common discourse whereby actual utterances are recognized as events of common, reasonable, understandable, plain talk. From this, he would argue that any departure from these expectations would immediately be met with confusion, bewilderment, or even anger. So in order to help his student observe the sanctioned character of these properties, Garfinkel devised a set of tutorials, exercises, that his students would have to perform in everyday situations. These so-called breaching experiments were no experiments in a scientific sense. They were rather illustrations of what happens when we don't act according to the background expectancies. In one example, the students were instructed to engage an acquaintance or a friend in an ordinary conversation, and without revealing that it was an experiment, insist that the person clarify the sense of some commonplace remark. The students were then asked to report back on their interactions. In one case, the subject was telling the experimenter, a member of the subject's carpool, about having had a flat tire while going to work the previous day. The subject said, "I had a flat tire." The experimenter then responded, "What do you mean you had a flat tire?" She appeared momentarily stunned. Then she answered in a hostile way, "What do you mean? What do you mean? A flat tire is a flat tire. That is what I meant. Nothing special. What a crazy question." As illustrated by this case, many of the reports spoke about the feelings aroused by these seemingly trivial modifications to the interactions. When confronted with the students' abnormal behaviors, family members vigorously tried to make the strange actions understandable and to bring the situation back to normal. The reports were filled with accounts of astonishment, bewilderment, shock, anxiety, embarrassment, and anger, and with charges by various family members that the student was mean, inconsiderate, selfish, nasty, or impolite. And they demanded explanations. What's the matter? What's gotten into you? Did you get fired? Are you sick? What are you being so superior about? Why are you mad? Are you out of your mind, or are you just stupid? A central lesson from these experiments was not only that it was possible to break from the background expectancies and thereby generate these emotionally charged responses. The responses themselves presented the mechanisms through which we can normalize the situation and restore the order. Our natural attitude is to act on the assumption that we understand each other, so whenever evidence to the contrary presents itself, work is carried out to address the problem. In this way, the manner in which we create a sense of shared meaning from the words we use is by an interactive process. Based on these insights, a new kind of sociology emerged during the 60s and 70s. Harvey Sachs and his colleagues, Gail Jefferson and Manny Shegloff, among others, began to make detailed studies of interaction. By closely examining the turn-by-turn construction of talk and interaction, it was found out that it is in fact possible to see how people interpret and make sense of each other. This is not something happening silently in their heads. It is rather work on display. Because if persons want to accomplish something together, they must design their actions and display their intentions for others to see, and they must show their own interpretation as well. This short sequence taken from Shegloff illustrates how this can play out. It comes from a group therapy session with teenagers. And here, Dan, who is the therapist, offers a characterization of Al, who is one of the participants. Now, one of the other participants, Roger, understands this as a critique or a complaint. and he responds by asserting solidarity with his friend. So here, in what we can call the first turn, Dan provides his characterization of how Al tends to act. Next, Al himself begins to respond, but he is interrupted by Roger. We can call Roger's response the second turn. It is second in the sense that it is referring back to what Dan said. With this second turn, Roger displays his understanding of what he took Dan to be doing, and it does so by showing solidarity with his buddy. In the third turn, Dan, in response, acts on this displayed understanding. Here, he can either accept or reject Roger's interpretation. As we can see, he corrects the second turn by making explicit that he was not out to criticize Al, but only to talk about him. This brief exchange is just an example of how some people there and then would come to an agreement on what was being said and done. But the example speaks to a larger issue, how meaning can be made common or shared through procedures carried out over time. On this note, Garfinkel wrote that the appropriate image of a common understanding is therefore an operation rather than a common intersection of overlapping sets. The empirical study of these practices and operations turned out to be a very fruitful enterprise. By working from audio-taped recordings of interactions, it was soon discovered that people use many more features than just words in serial order. Many of the seemingly minute details played a significant role in the organization of social life. In this next example of a telephone conversation to a hairdresser, I have provided a transcript which roughly captures the words uttered in the exchange. But there are many more so-called production features that are not made visible. I will play back the audio once and urge you to listen for the missing details.
So how can I help you?
Hi, I'm calling to book a women's haircut for a client. I'm looking for something on May 3rd.
Sure, give me 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, what time are you looking for around?
At 12 p.m.
We do not have a 12 p.m. available. The closest we have to that is a 1:15.
This alternative transcript follows some of the conventions developed by Gail Jefferson for how to capture additional details of talk. In this transcript, we measure the length of pauses or gaps down to the 10th of a second. It also marks stretched out words or emphasis and rising intonations. And things that were traditionally seen as noise, like restarts or thinking sounds, are marked and analyzed. Even minimal responses like continuers are seen as central to the interactions, as they produce evidence for the participants that they can go on. With all of this history and detailed examinations of how people build joint understanding through talk, I again want to raise the prospect of human-machine interaction. If we move much closer to our own time, many companies are now developing advanced forms of natural language processing. Alexa, Siri, and Google Assistant are nowadays common in many households and on our mobile devices. In 2018, Google showcased a system named Duplex at their developer conference.
As I said earlier, our vision for our assistant is to help you get things done. It turns out a big part of getting things done is making a phone call. You may want to get an oil change schedule, maybe call a plumber in the middle of the week, or even schedule a haircut appointment. We are working hard to help users through those moments. We want to connect users to businesses in a good way. Businesses actually rely a lot on this, but even in the US, 60% of small businesses don't have an online booking system set up. We think AI can help with this problem. So let's go back to this example. Let's say you want to ask Google to make you a haircut appointment on Tuesday between 10 and noon. What happens is the Google Assistant makes the call seamlessly in the background for you. So what you're going to hear is the Google Assistant actually calling a real salon to schedule the appointment for you. Let's listen.
So how can I help you?
Hi, I'm calling to book a women's haircut for a client. I'm looking for something on May 3rd.
Sure, give me 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, what time are you looking for around?
At 12 p.m.
We do not have a 12 p.m. available. The closest we have to that is a 1:15.
Do you have anything between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m.?
Depending on what service she would like. What service is she looking for?
Just a woman's haircut for now.
Okay, we have a 10 o'clock.
10 a.m. is fine.
Okay, what's her first name?
The first name is Lisa.
Okay, perfect. So I will see Lisa at 10 o'clock on May 3rd.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Great. Have a great day. Bye.
That was a real call you just heard. The amazing thing is the assistant can actually understand the nuances of conversation. We've been working on this technology for many years. It's called Google Duplex. It brings together all our investments over the years in natural language understanding, deep learning, text-to-speech. By the way, when we are done, the assistant can give you a confirmation notification saying your appointment has been taken care of.
Judging from the reactions of the crowd, the responses to this could be understood as overwhelmingly positive. But technology journalists and others reporting on this later on were not equally sold on the idea. Some saw this technology as further gasoline on the fire that is fake news and general mistrust in society. Others would raise the philosophical question of how we should relate to AI once it becomes this lifelike. What followed was also what we could describe as a laic interest in talk's production features. With this, I mean that people who would not regularly investigate the details of spoken interaction started to make such analysis in order to discover who was an AI or not. As soon as the suspicion of possible deception was raised, the game was on to try and find the artificial deceiver. In a manner of speaking, Turing's imitation game had now escaped the laboratories and ventured out into the larger world. In the investigations that followed, some would produce their own recordings of dinner reservations with the duplex service and make them available for further analysis.
Hello, Cafe Prague?
Hi, I'm calling to make a reservation for a client. I'm calling from Google, so the call may be recorded. Can I book a table for tomorrow, please?
Yes, at what time would you like to reserve?
At 7 p.m.
Okay, perfect. How many people?
It's for 2 people.
Okay, 2 people tomorrow at 7 p.m. What's her name?
The first name is Anna.
Anna. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Cool, thank you very much. Thank you, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Great, that was seamless. All right, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks, Marta.
Based on this recording, people started to analyze the minute details of the talk in order to find the evidence that would give away the caller as being a robot. One person pointed to the 1.5-second pause at the beginning of the call. Another one wrote that they could easily spot that it was a bot given the directness of introducing the reason for the call after only a brief opening. Some were less skeptical, however, and one of the criticisms that Google had received in relation to Duplex was that the digital assistant never self-identified or said that it would record the call. Some commenters would pick up on this. One person wrote, "I love how Google said they would let people know it is a robot so the critics would shut up, yet they made it so subtle at the beginning." Another commentator was eager for what would come after this and wrote, "In a year it's going to be twice as good, and twice as good as that in another. I can't wait." Still, not everyone was convinced that this was actually a call made by a digital assistant. Like this sarcastic comment, for instance. "Wow, a human speaking to a human. Technology these days. What will they think of next? I'm going to coin the term phone call." But skeptics would not go unchallenged. Correcting the faulty understandings of others is, after all, what internet does best. That you thought it was actually a human speaking to human shows how far developed the AI and digital voice technology has actually become. And you are far from the only one who has gotten fooled by the voice, mistaking it for a human. Here, layer upon layer of suspicion and mistrust colored the alternative interpretations of the nature of the caller in this episode. In the end, the true nature was uncovered. To train their AI, Google would also use human callers to create a baseline for the system, and it was later disclosed that the caller in this particular conversation was in fact a human. In one sense, we could say that this person, calling on behalf of someone else to make a dinner reservation, had failed the Turing test. But we need to remember that there was nothing particularly damning about the caller's performance. As a reservation for dinner, the call was a success without any remarkable mishaps. The reason for the suspicion was rather seeded by Google's announcement that they would use AI for the service. With this suspicion in hand, even ordinary conversational parties can now be rendered into what is hearable as artificial agents. Trying our best as we do to pass as human, it seems we now face the prospect of having our humanity called into question. Next up, I would like to move these ideas into the near future. This will be a thought experiment, but the necessary technologies are already existing if someone would care to assemble them. We are imagining this woman, Maria, and that she is attending a work meeting. Discussions are progressing very slowly, and halfway through the agenda, Maria realizes that she will have to work late. This is a problem since she was supposed to pick up her daughter from school. So, while still at the meeting, she opens up her digital assistant and commissions it with a task to check whether her spouse can help out. What happens next is that the assistant makes a call in the background. It is using Maria's associated caller ID, but not only that, it is also impersonating her vocally by mimicking her voice and ways of speaking.
Hi.
Hi there. I'm at this meeting that is running late. Could you perhaps pick him up from school today?
Sure, no problem. I'm getting tired here anyway.
Great.
When do you think you will be home?
The traffic forecast looks okay, so I should be back by 7 the latest.
All right, I'll prepare dinner then. And, maybe you could grab some more cilantro on your way back?
Sure.
Great. See you later.
Bye.
Back at the meeting, Maria now receives a message from the assistant telling her that her daughter will get a ride from school. There are several aspects of this example that we might be at odds with. Let me list some of them. In the thought experiment, the assistant is using the caller ID of the client. This means that the answerer can be confident about who is calling and tailor the answer accordingly. This is why we have a recognitional greeting, the hi, as an opening of the call. Now the response to this could be the perfect opportunity to correct the mistaken claim of recognition. But that is not what happens. First of all, just like the example with the duplex service, the assistant in this case is not self-identifying as a digital assistant. Instead, it is vocally mimicking the client, thereby providing further evidence that the answerer had been correct. But not only that, the assistant goes on to self-identify as the client when it says, "I'm at this meeting." That such self-identification by proxy is done towards a significant other, the spouse, is perhaps another level of deceit added here. And finally, as trivial as these interactions may seem, it could be argued that they are the bread and butter of our social life, of being together. Here, that sense of shared history is perhaps corrupted by delegating this task to a third party. If we combine all of this together, the psychological reasoning of Jentsch and Freud and Mori with the social perspectives laid out by Schütz and Garfinkel, what will be the outcome? How could this help us think about a future of interactions with lifelike technologies? First of all, we could see that there are clear parallels in the described reactions to experience deviations from the familiar. The visceral responses to the unexpected are not confined only to our immediate perceptions, as when we come across a disturbing image. The same responses can follow upon inapposite actions, something well explored in drama and comedy. Second, I would argue that the curve proposed by Mori, the uncanny valley, as it were, does not hold up to its promise. There is little reason to believe that with more realistic agents, the feelings of creepiness will dissipate. This could be called the realism fallacy. As long as we are being told up front that our interactional partners are digital agents, I don't think that those conversations will necessarily be experienced as awkward. But technical advancements will not compensate for the lack of reciprocity of perspectives. We can have functional interactions without these being grounded in shared experiences. It is rather the suspicion or the possibility of deceit that renders interactions uncanny. Once this genie is let out of the bottle, the effects could be lasting. Like with the dinner reservation example, under certain circumstances, people will now start to perceive other people as if they were technical systems. And if we start to mistrust who is behind an appearance, their motives will also be called into question. When Garfinkel devised his breaching experiments, he did a series of exercises that explored the deliberate display of distrust. These episodes would reveal definite and very strong relations between common understandings and social effects. In those experiments, students were first instructed to engage someone in conversation and to imagine and act on the assumption that what the other person was saying was directed by hidden motives. They were to assume that the other person was trying to trick them or mislead them. One observation from this was that for many students, this assumption that the other person was not what he appeared to be and was to be distrusted was the same as the attribution that the other person was angry with them and hated them. On the other hand, many of the victims complained that the student had no reason to be angry with them and offered attempts at explanation and conciliation. But when this didn't work, the victims instead offered displays of anger and disgust. The students were surprised to learn, as one of them reported, that once I started acting the role of a hated person, I actually came to feel somewhat hated, and by the time I left the table, I was quite angry. The affective states of anger and hate, only simulated when entering into this experiment, quickly materialized into actual experiences. In what lies ahead, we have to ask the question if technology can give rise to similar effects. By grafting lifelike interactive technologies onto the primary mechanisms by which we are creating our sense of reality, we might be entering into a new dark age. The repercussions on our humanity are not known to us. Perhaps the uncanny valley is but a grave, and, to put it in the words of H.P. Lovecraft, for the peace and safety of mankind, some of Earth's dark, dead corners and unplumbed depths should be let alone.